Hello and welcome to week 5 of Searching for Reality. This week we're going to take a look at two cultures and the medieval period. So specifically, the two cultures that we are going to discuss are the Indo-European. So we'll talk about the language, the worldview, and its sort of philosophical and theological background, and compare it to the Semitic language and worldview and philosophies that are associated with it. Together, over a period of 500 years or so, they merged together and set the foundation for what is now Western civilization or Western culture. From there, we'll look at Rome, the fall of Rome, and how that leads to the beginnings of theology as both a philosophy and as a political agenda. And we'll end up in the medieval period looking at St. Anselm and Thomas Aquinas. So the three main ideas: the two cultures, the fall of Rome, and the subsequent beginnings of medieval philosophy. So the first thing I wanted to look at is the West as these two cultures, which I cannot stress enough as a wonderful way to defeat any kind of racist argument of the superiority of Western culture. Just remind people that Western culture is a result of a range of languages and philosophies and cultures and worldviews that come from elsewhere. From Iran, from northern India, from the Middle East. So it's not pure. This is something we need to be reminded of, because that's essentially the notion of two cultures. In Gardner's book, we talk about Western civilization specifically as what he calls a syncretic combination. What that means is two distinctly different things. Right? Yes, they're both cultures, but they are distinctly different in their worldview, their understandings of theological matters and philosophical matters. So they are syncretic in the sense that they are quite different from one another, but they do merge together into what we eventually look back to call the beginnings of Western civilization. Now, one of the really important differences is Indo-European. Now, Indo-European is this group of languages that stem from basically from the Middle East as far east as northern India, but it takes the Mideast, parts of the Far East. There is debate as to how far it goes east, but certainly it is the Middle East and northern India, very much so. So hence the idea Indo-European. So it's a family of languages, and along with the languages are the worldviews that those languages allow individuals to express and to believe in. Hence, this is why we're talking about these family of language, or this family of languages in this particular course. Because in our search for reality, the language that we use to express the reality we experience has a lot to do with the way that we think and the way in which that worldview is expressed through words. So Indo-European is a kind of root. Right? It's a kind of collective thought that ties together this family of languages, also known as Proto-Indo-European. But really within that are at least 10 subfamilies. The Germanic language, of which English is part of, Hellenic, which is Greek, Indo-Iranic, Persian as well, Celtic, and so on. It's an incredibly rich group of languages which move out over a long period of time into Europe. So that's what we mean when we say the Indo-European linguistic background of Western civilization. It comes from that. So what does that mean for us when we talk about Western civilization? As I stressed this at the beginning, it means that we don't have a pure Western culture. It is the syncretic movement of other languages and worldviews brought together. And with those, their philosophies, their theologies. And so the result is that we have this interesting hybrid of these different points of view, because one is polytheistic while the other is monotheistic. One focuses on sight as the metaphor for knowledge, while the other focuses on the ear or hearing. And we're going to get into that. But they're quite different, but somehow they merge. Now, the way in which they merge to the point where eventually monotheism wins out. It becomes the more dominant of the two. So before going any further, we need to stress that we should be careful about this idea of Western civilization. Okay, there is a lot of interchange. There's a lot of movement back and forth there as a result of trade routes. many different influences on language, on culture, on philosophy, on modes of thought, on theology, that all sort of over time kind of bubble away and become this new thing. Well, this bubbling away is all of this interaction of all these types of languages and these worldviews, and eventually they distill down into what we call Western civilization. And of course, there are interactions previous to that between ancient Greeks and the Egyptians. When we talk about pre-Socratic thought, for example, we can consider some of the amazing ideas that Thales is attributed as to having. And we know, for example, that he learned those from the Egyptians. And the Egyptians had been around for many thousands of years. There were Babylonian cultures, Assyrian cultures, a whole range of people that the Greeks studied with and learned from. And so Egyptian certainly was one of the most powerful. So the Greek language takes all of this knowledge and brings it in to this Indo-European world, right? This umbrella, along with all these other languages. So incredibly rich. Now, as this is happening, many of these important texts that we discuss now, texts written by Plato, by Aristotle, Epicurus, Heraclitus, many of these other writers, these Greek writers, or Athenian writers specifically, over time get lost, right? They disappear from the canon of scholastic learning. And if it wasn't for translations, think about this. If it wasn't for translations, we would have forgotten about Plato and Aristotle. We wouldn't even be discussing them right now in 2020 if it wasn't for that interaction, that very polyglot, sort of multicultural worldview this early, right? This early, 2,000 years ago at least. And someone had the wherewithal to someone had the wherewithal to translate these texts and then turn around and store them and save them in a new language. So from Greek, it was translated into a variety of other languages, but it was held onto. And in fact, it was a lot of Muslim scholars, right? It's eventually Islamic scholars, who were the ones who were busy translating many of these important texts, especially those by Aristotle. So we have Islamic philosophers to thank and Islamic translators to thank for keeping that tradition alive in their own language. So in this map here, you can see the amount of interaction in this very rich region in here. So we have India, the Eurasian Sea. We've got parts of the Middle East here, and then we've got sections of North Africa. So we've got Egypt, we've got all of the Middle East, and then up here we've got Greece, and we've got Rome. So there's all this interaction that is happening over a long period of time. And that interaction eventually creates these sort of hybrid polyglot languages, these new languages that develop out of old ones, merge with them, now start to borrow words from one another. And all of it is because of the use of language, the way in which language allows us to express our deepest thoughts, our most profound ideas. And those languages that we speak right now, you and I, speaking in English, for example, come ultimately from this Indo-European tradition. Now, it shouldn't be a surprise, but those languages account for about almost half of all languages on Earth. 45% of all languages spoken on the Earth come from this Indo-European tradition. That's how rich it is. So, if that's the case, we can understand how profoundly important it is to look at this foundation in Western civilization and realize the degree to which we are now thankful for other cultures maintaining a particular tradition alive and then transporting it over for us to partake in. The important texts, Plato, Aristotle, the Greeks, Islamic philosophers, other philosophers, Roman philosophers, they were all kept in these other translations and then translated back, whether it was Latin or any number of other languages. They were there and they were translated and they were stored. Now, linguistic extinction, the way in which languages die out, that is something that linguists are still studying, because a whole range of issues can occur that would cause a language to die out, up to and including simply the number of people that are using it. Even today, we have parts of the world where very few people still speak a certain dialect or a certain language. And when those people die, that'll be the end of it. That language will die with them. So because we're talking about searching for reality and not linguistics, we'll set that aside. But there is a vested interest in understanding how languages do perish, right? How they pass away, and a range of different explanations have been used to explain why that is. Now, when we talk about Indo-European concepts that are tied to this language, Gardner, in his book, identifies sort of four very general concepts. And this is shared more or less by other Indo-European worldviews. And he talks about sort of four general ones. The first one is this notion of polytheism, and that is the notion of many gods, right? Compare that with monotheism, mono being one God. So polytheism comes from that Indo-European background, which includes Greece, which includes, again, the Middle East, parts of the Far East, northern India, where there is a polytheistic view of the natural world. Some other cultures also believe in pantheism. Pantheism is also this notion that gods, many gods, exist now in the world, in our world. And the result is that we have sacred objects or sacred animals. In India, the cow is considered sacred for that reason. So in this Indo-European tradition, we have these four ideas. The first one being polytheism. Now, polytheism, this notion of many, some of the things that are part of this worldview is dualistic thinking. And dualistic thinking is we have kind of a one versus the other, right? And the notion of good versus evil is part of this polytheistic worldview. So you may have many gods, but you can still have dualistic thinking. The two are compatible. And of course, the most important issue, especially when it comes to theology, is the issue of good versus evil. We'll see how Aquinas addresses that issue as well. The second one is speculative or historical explanations. We have in terms of speculative thinking about the origin of things, or, for example, if the fourth one, the cyclical view of the universe, this is speculative notion that universes will come into being and collapse and die and return again. So there's this constant expansion and a contraction, right? Not necessarily a big bang, but this notion that the speculation about the universe is that it is cyclical, that it continues to exist, but it will die away and come back. It will expand and contract. It will be constantly moving in this sort of cyclical pattern. So that's a kind of speculative historical explanation of, for example, the universe, which is cosmology. The third one with Indo-European concepts is this focus on sight as a metaphor for knowledge. And again, think about the ancient Greeks, right? The Athenians, the pre-Socratics especially, that looked at the material world, like looked carefully at the material world and matter, and began to devise ideas about the world based on what they saw, right? Focus on sight, so important as this metaphor to be able to see and experience the world. And then, like I say, the last one, this cyclical view of the universe. And so when you have a cyclical view of the universe, that is a view that the universe has also always been there, right? That fits in with pre-Socratic thought. That, for the most part, fits in with Platonic thought about the universe and the roles of gods in this universe, that they have always been there. Now, whether that universe expands and contracts, it may, hence it is cyclical, but it never completely and in a catastrophic destruction die away for sure. Now, to point out, take these concepts sort of not necessarily with a grain of salt completely that they're wrong, but they're very wide categories, right? They are these four concepts that are there, but you can certainly find deviations and contradictions within these four general ones. Okay, so that was the Indo-European tradition. The Abrahamic religions come from the Semitic tradition. And the Semitic tradition is not about polytheism, but about monotheism. And here we have the three largest I'm not going to say the greatest, but I'm going to say the three largest religions that also happen to be monotheistic: Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. So they all have this Semitic origin in the Middle East. That is where they come from. That is where the history begins. Now, in fact, it should be Judaism first, then Christianity, and finally Islam. They actually do evolve in that sense. So why are they Abrahamic? Well, the figure of Abraham is important in all of them. And for example, with Judaism, right, the Israelites were believed to be descendants of Abraham's son, Isaac. With Islam, the prophet Muhammad was held to be a descendant of Ishmael, who is Abraham's son with Hagar. So Abraham is an important, crucial figure, pivotal figure in all three of those religions, right? All three of those monotheistic religions, not polytheistic. Now, Christianity is different in the sense that, again, as Gardner points out, it's different because, yes, while it is Semitic, it was written in a Semitic language. It actually was written in the Koine Greek, right? Koine Greek, which is an Indo-European language. So there's a bit of kind of muddying of the waters. So it's written in a language that belongs to the Indo-European tradition, but it is a Semitic worldview. It's a Semitic monotheistic worldview, certainly about theology. And as a matter of fact, Christ spoke Aramaic. So it was not even Greek. That was, again, another specific language. So the belief was Christ spoke Aramaic, which also was, I believe, an Indo-European language, because it was Greek-based, I believe. So again, there's a little bit of fudging and smudging a little bit. So these are not consistently sort of impenetrable or interpenetratable, concepts. There is some overlap. Now, the Gospels that come out of these two cultures, as I mentioned, eventually monotheism wins the day. So that's kind of where we're headed as we sort of move towards that. And then early thinkers, early theologians such as St. Augustine. So the Gospels themselves in Christianity were considered to be written after the death of Christ. So we have, with the exception of St. Paul, very few individuals who are writing the Gospels who knew Christ firsthand. They were passing down an oral tradition. Right? They were passing down information that they had conveyed to them by others. So they were in around the mid first century. Christ had died, the belief is between 33 or 34 AD. In fact, the beginning of the AD period is the birth of Christ, the first year. So they're writing around 50 AD and beyond. So Christ has already he's left the earth for at least 20 years at this point. So it's fresh. It's still fresh, but Christ is no longer around to correct these Gospels. They're written by individuals who spoke to people who knew Christ or were followers of Christ. So these texts were written by Hellenistic Jews that spoke this interesting form of Greek, this Koine form of Greek. And the Q document, and there's a link right here, the Q document, you can take a look at it. It gives you a lot of background as to the source material of the Gospels by Matthew and Luke, for example. The Gospel of Mark is believed to have come from a different source. But these individuals were writing at a time after Christ, but this was immediately after, sort of very, very fresh in their minds. So once again, we have this syncretic view, right? These two different things coming together. Syncretic view here of this post-Alexander the Great Greek-influenced world from the Koine Greek, and this monotheistic Semitic world. So individuals are using Greek to talk about Semitic matters. Again, another kind of fudging and muddying of the waters a little bit, which, shouldn't make it difficult to understand. It's combining these two things, because eventually, remember, they merge as one. So these are individual examples that begin this Western civilization, this notion of Western civilization, to use one language to discuss an entirely different set of ideas and matters that belonged to the first language, but are actually discussing another one. So if you look at this chart here, we can see, in fact, that the Judaic tradition is around here, around 1400 BC. So this is this is around the dark ages of ancient Greece. This is where everything is lost, around 1200. So 1400 BC is believed to be the beginnings of the Jewish religion. Then we move along again. We see it's polytheistic. Now, polytheistic for the most part, but Judaism had only a singular God. And we move along to this area here, 600 BC, and this is the area roughly where we have been for the last few weeks, talking about the pre-Socratics, talking about Plato and Aristotle. This is where we are. So we're talking about quite some time later, roughly 1200 years. So the Old Testament goes from polytheistic thinking to monotheistic thinking. So that's where the start begins. So we switch from many gods to singular gods. And so it does eventually merge here, and then you can see monotheism all the way through. 4 BC, more or less, the birth of Christ. And in 610 AD is the beginning of Islam, right? The preachings of Muhammad. So what is the difference here? Here's what's going on. These Abrahamic religions, right, are not saying other gods do not exist, but they are saying that there is one true God, and God is in fact jealous of individuals who are not believing just him. They're believing in other gods as well. Thou shalt not have any false gods before me. That's what that refers to, the Ten Commandments. So the notion with the influence of Judaism towards monotheism is this idea. It's not saying that those other gods don't exist, but that there are other deities that should not be worshipped. And as you can imagine, if you have the capacity and, again, the political power to make that kind of a call, then clearly you reserve the right to designate who is a good, a positive God versus a negative God. And here you start having the sort of degradation or downgrading of certain spirits. They become evil spirits. We have the notion of Satan, for example, starting at this particular time, because Satan was part of this realm that included God and was a fallen angel. So these stories are the way in which monotheistic thought can set aside these secondary gods and denigrate them and make them evil, and then at the same time celebrate a single God, a monotheistic God. But the belief is thought, or this belief in monotheism starts around 600 BC. So that's what I wanted to state here. So Abrahamic cosmology, that is the beginning and end of the universe and the sort of the history and origins of the universe. Now, Indo-Europeans had this cyclical view, right? An eternal expansion and contraction of the universe. Semitic cultures, in fact, had a linear, right? A straight line with a beginning and, very importantly, an end. So Semitic cultures had a linear view of history. So that means there was a singular beginning. In the beginning, there was nothing. God made the world. There is your cataclysmic beginning. It wasn't like one day things were different. He changed. No, he starts it utterly. Utterly begins the universe and begins everything that we know. So there's that linear view. But there's also the catastrophic end, right? We talk about end times or the rapture or any of these things that are associated with Christianity. So unlike Indo-European views, worldviews about the universe is eternally, contracting, expanding, and then contracting again, we have this linear thought about history, a distinct beginning and, unfortunately, a distinct end. Now, that end is not prophesied as occurring at a certain time. We know those end times could occur at any moment, and depending how difficult things are at a certain, at a given time, some people believe that the end times are going to appear sooner, right? It will more rapidly end up in this position. So that's the worldview about history in Semitic culture. It's linear, right? In terms of cosmology, the beginnings of the universe, a singular moment, God creates it, and God can destroy it at the end. So that is the way in which we look at the development of the universe, right, in these two particular cultures. Now, the other thing too that Gardner points out in this book is the contrast between this Indo-European focus on sight, right? That we see with the pre-Socratics and Plato and Aristotle, Epicurus as well, the focus on sight, to see the world, to experience the world firsthand. And then you focus, or you sort of turn our attention to Semitic ideas about hearing. And so hearing is important because there is a strong, strong tradition in this oral culture on stories being handed down. Now, again, there's a little bit of muddying here because we can also recall the Indo-European, tradition of mythology. And mythology for the ancient Greeks was the depository, right? The storehouse of previous knowledge. Stories about, why nature acted the way it did. So there is, again, these are not hard facts. Generally speaking, sight is privileged in an Indo-European worldview, while hearing is privileged in a Semitic culture. But again, there is always some overlap. But notions of mythology, notions of oral traditions, the authority of spoken revelation, God has spoken, the recitation of verse, discussion, debate, and dialogue, which is integral. It's integral to Judaism, to sit and discuss passages from the Torah. So speech and hearing are of primary importance in Semitic culture. Now, Gardner talks about biblical accounts of Genesis, the beginning. Remember this singular beginning, the fall of man, the covenants with Abraham, the time in Egypt. These are all parts of the biblical stories. Now, there is questions about historical accuracy. Some individuals read the Bible letter by letter, and it is literally the gospel truth, right? That expression of gospel truth means everything happened exactly the way it was described. Others take a more metaphoric view of the parables, because a parable is a story about, right? It's not a historical narrative. It's not a news report. It's a story about something. So others take sort of a more mythological, metaphoric view of biblical stories. Wherever you stand, the historical accuracy of these stories can be difficult to pin down, because some things are believed to have happened. Others sort of think versions of these things happened, like the time that the Jews spent in the desert upon leaving Egypt. This could be more of a mythology. They were exiled. People used to be exiled all the time in the Middle East. It was something that happened. People were exiled for their beliefs, and when you're exiled, you're thrown out of the city gates. So you could mythologize that time period and make it perhaps much worse in order to drive home the point being we were exiled, right? That's what is at the crux of the story. So we need to just make sure that the story there is not lost through the embellishments, because certainly mythology, in this case, the fact that the Jews wandered the deserts for 40 years. The real story behind that is the fact that the misfortunes, right, of God's chosen people. That's what matters, right? They disobeyed, and God punished them by letting them wander the desert for 40 years. It is the kind of causal relationships between what was done and its immediate effect. That's really what matters in these particular kinds of stories. So, what Gardner talks about in terms of religious thought at this very early time is also to the notions of prophecies, right? Start taking on political overtones, because at this particular time, during the birth of Christ, and especially the adult life of Christ, there are serious political issues that are going on in the Middle East, specifically where Jesus is living. And what that is that area is now under Roman occupation. So they are occupied by a foreign power. So the stories about, an anointed king, a Messiah, a leader who will save us, those ideas, just by the very nature and where they occur, the context in which they occur, become political. If you talk about a savior that is going to lead us so that we can be free, if you say those words under occupation, by their very nature, they are political. So let's keep that in mind, because in that worldview, the teachings of Christ were not explicitly political, but they were in a very clearly political context. Because if anything, Jesus is offering salvation, right? And he's offering redemption. He's offering pacifism. And he is not saying, burn the place to the ground. We're going to attack everyone with swords. No, he's not. But he is a figure that rallies a group of individuals, of other individuals, around this political notion of freedom, right? And overthrowing the shackles of foreign occupation. In this case, the Roman soldiers who are there. Because remember, it's the Roman soldiers who crucify Christ. That's why they're there in the story. So there are some links here if you wish to look at the gospel account. There's some of the historical facts. Historically, we know that the Romans were occupying that area. And we historically know that if Christ was killed, he was killed most certainly by the Romans. Why? Because crucifixion was a favored form of torture and execution for treasonous individuals. So the words of Jesus were considered treasonous in that particular context. That's why he was crucified, because those political agitators and those who don't want to follow a Roman law are considered treason or treasonous. So that's why he was crucified. So important to remember. Now, St. Paul, who is obviously a saint and associated with Christ, knew him briefly and was alive at the same time. In his writings, he talks about bodily resurrection. And this is an idea that also can be associated to Aristotle, because he also believed the same thing. And remember, for about 1,000 years, these books are lost, right? Aristotle's and Plato's writings are lost, and they come back, and yet they marry up rather nicely with Christian thought, Christian theology at this particular point. But it starts with St. Paul talking about bodily resurrection, this notion of a soul, right? A soul that can transmigrate, right? That can live on, that is immortal. These ideas come from Greek thought. And if you look in De Anima, in Aristotle's book, very similar ideas. Christ will not be born for another 300 years at this point, and yet here's Aristotle talking about the transmigration of the soul, the immortality of the intellect, right, that part of the soul. These things are all there, and St. Paul describes them with a kind of a theological configuration, theological bend. But he's talking about ideas which belong in philosophy. They're already there. And he talks about, again, this notion of the soul transmigrating, the soul being immortal. And so we have this this kind of thinking that belongs elsewhere, but is incredibly useful. So later theology came down to this Greek Platonic soul, not body, right? The body dies away and the soul lives on. Transmigration of souls, the immortality of souls, come from Platonic and especially Aristotelian kind of thinking. So traditional polytheism at this point starts to ebb. It still continues, because even during Roman times there are polytheistic gods. We think about Roman mythology, which is basically a transposition of Greek mythology. The various gods and goddesses sound suspiciously and surprisingly like Greek mythology, because essentially they are. That's where they come from. Now, the earliest theologian, and if you see the date, right, 354 to 430 AD, right? So now we're moving past not only the birth, but the death of Christ in 33, 34 AD. So we're looking at, roughly 300 and something years. So again, Christ is long gone. Paul has been beheaded. Many of the people that knew Christ immediately, long gone. But Augustine is one of the very first early theologians and early church fathers who saw the benefits of philosophy as a way to structure theological thought. And in fact was considered a Neoplatonist, right? Because this is what's around at the time. We talked about Neoplatonism last week very, very briefly. But Neoplatonic thought is best expressed in St. Augustine's thinking, where he takes Plato's notion of ideas and forms, which are abstract things, right? Not things you can see or hold, but just things, ideas in our minds. And now he embodies Platonic ideas in the perfection of God. So we have the perfection of ideas and forms that Plato spoke about. And say 700 years later, roughly, we have St. Augustine saying essentially the same thing, structuring religious thought the same way, but substituting Plato's idea, abstract idea, with this notion of God, of a Godhead who is eternal, perfect in every way, just like Plato had said. So this is another way in which this kind of thinking sort of merges, and it uses everything that's at its power, philosophical thought. It uses it as a kind of scaffolding to build theology out of it. So unlike other Neoplatonists, because there's a sense of mysticism and polytheism, which is unique to Neoplatonists, with Augustine, he was not a pantheist. In other words, he was not a believer that gods are everywhere in the world. This is something that belongs to Platonic thought, and it's kind of an Indo-European thought from further back. So God and the world are separate. And that really is in keeping with Plato's thoughts. Because although we can connect with a notion of perfect forms and ideas, we do it through reason. And Augustine says, absolutely, you can use reason to understand God as well. So not a huge leap from the kind of Greek thinking or Athenian thinking we've been discussing to early theological formulations that use Greek thought as a kind of scaffolding to start building theology. And eventually theology sort of exists on its own. Now, the two most important books for St. Augustine are City of God and Confessions. Now, in Confessions, this is essentially St. Augustine talking about all the trials and tribulations he had, sort of rejecting the notion of God, rejecting theology. And he says essentially in one day he cracked open what was a kind of Bible at this point, and it's just, he was thunderstruck. This is it. And he just put down the book. He says, this is what I've been looking for all my life. So essentially the Confessions are St. Augustine's doubt, right, about theology and Christianity. And then finally his absolute embracing of it. Now, City of God is another equally interesting book where he talks about theological questions, about the possibility of salvation, something that he now has to believe in because he believes that he has been saved by opening up the book and reading and believing what he sees. The problem of evil, the notion of free will, omniscience, the all-powerfulness of God, and of course, original sin. And ultimately, if you want to sort of give the City of God a kind of a thumbnail review, it's a presentation of conflicts, right, between the city of earth, the worldly things, the material things that we have, our sensuous desires, our drives, our passions here on earth, and the city of God, which are all the spiritual matters. And clearly, we wish to travel towards the city of God. All the things that we need to sublimate and hold in check through salvation, through control of the free will. All of these things we are going to now be conscious of and try to sublimate and take hold of and seize in order for us to focus our movement towards, right, our travel towards the city of God. So here again, right, this notion of the city of earth, worldly things, city of God in a separate place, spiritual matters, again, is this kind of Platonic view of the world. This idea of, the material world will come to be and perish away, right? Physically, our bodies will perish away. Our soul will transmigrate and will live on. And so we have the material world on the one hand, and utterly disconnected is the spiritual or abstract reality, which we can only connect with using reason. So again, we haven't discarded philosophy. We've used many of its useful tools in order to make sense of how to live our life. So here, just briefly, we'll look at the fall of the Roman Empire and then how that segues into medieval thought and medieval theology. And essentially, the decline of Rome starts around 370 AD. So this is, again, at least 300 and some years after the death of Christ. Through constant warfare, the Roman Empire and the fall of Rome here, right? This is Rome, the city, is constantly being attacked until finally around 410, it's finally crushed, right? And so at this point too, the Roman Empire has been, moving further and radiating out into the Middle East and further north, even as far as England and Ireland. There are archaeological digs that can prove that. So Rome itself as a city begins to fall apart and is finally sacked in 410. And there is some political stability, but Rome just simply is not the power center that it used to be, years and years ago. So around 1100 to 1200 AD, so this is roughly 1,000 years after the fall of Rome, or the beginning of the fall of Rome. Remember here that there's a kind of political vacuum here. There's a vacuum of some sort. And keep that in mind as we talk about the segue from polytheistic to monotheistic thought, because what does happen with St. Anselm is a better understanding of why he says the things that he does. So we have the Holy Roman Empire that by the 1800s is neither holy nor Roman, but prior to that we have this kind of vacuum that has both good and bad qualities, and that's what I want to look at here. Because we have feudalism, which is well entrenched at this point for nearly 1,000 years to 1200 AD for sure, and depending on where, it goes as far as the 14 to 1500s. We've got urban depletion, which is basically the ravaging of cities upon arable land. Urban sprawl is what we call it now, and constant warring. So if Western Europe is the cradle of civilization, don't forget that there was constant warring. This is not something that happens elsewhere. We think of civilization as somehow enlightened and peaceful and pacifistic. No, it's not. Constant warring, constant squabbles, borders moving back and forth. And as George Carlin once said, a border is where two warring factions finally got tired and decided to stop. So these are all the things that are going on that are negative. What is positive, though, is that we have the beginning of sort of proper education. We have individuals who are now able to go into universities. So universities are starting to flourish, are opening up. We've got cathedrals that are being built. I mean, some of these take 100 years to build, but money is being put into building huge cathedrals. The notion of scholarship and enlightenment and writing and thinking and philosophizing and all these aspects of culture are beginning to blossom, right? And they're blossoming in a very steady rate. And there's a lot of interaction between the Muslim world, the Christian world, and the Byzantine world as well. Byzantine, sort of the Far East, Mid East, kind of Ottoman Empire, Turkey, these areas. So a lot of cross-pollination, a lot of interaction between these cultures, both positive and negative. Sometimes through war, but other times through cross-cultural endeavors. And this sets the stage for the Renaissance, which is sort of the rediscovery of the human being, which keeps being rediscovered every 20 or 30 years. But it starts just around this particular time. Now, medieval philosophy, primarily speaking, is about theology. Right? It's if anyone else during that period wrote about anything else, we don't have those books anymore. They were either destroyed or never published. But medieval philosophy at this point is primarily concerned with theology, and it is concerned with theology in this particular way. Theology and medieval philosophy, did not want to dispense with reason. The role of reason within faith and within belief became even more important. So you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. You don't want to ignore, at this point now, almost 1,500 years worth of philosophy that is now the very scaffolding that you are using to build this theological edifice, we'll say. So you're not about to throw that out, because reason becomes one of the linchpins in theological thinking at this particular time. Not only do we have a reliance on reason as a tool, but we have, remember those translations that I told you way back sort of 1,000 years prior, that are being translated into other languages? Well, guess what? They begin to reappear at this point. So they start to reappear between about 1000 to 200 AD. And Ibn Rushd, again, one of the most important translators in the Muslim world, he commented and translated Aristotle's works. So if it was not for Rushdie, we would have not even had these particular texts to study today. So that is a kind of cross-pollination that was going on, not an attack on systematic ideas, but in fact a desire to hold on to these various individuals and their works through translation. So where they may have been lost or burned or discarded in one area, they were being preserved in another in a different language. So Ibn Rushd is perhaps one of the most important translators and sort of defenders of Aristotle at this point. And Aristotle's work becomes very important because we see it reappear roughly about, in this case, now 1,500 years after Aristotle has died. But his work now starts to come back in under what's called scholasticism, right? The scholastic tradition in philosophy is essentially a revisiting of Aristotle. In the same way as we have Plato and Neoplatonists, we have Aristotle and the scholastic tradition. So that's where Aristotle's ideas segue rather nicely into medieval philosophy, specifically of the theological kind. So the first person I want to look at is St. Anselm. And St. Anselm is one of these individuals that, understanding this political vacuum or this political influence that was once given to Rome, is now sort of spread out. There is room to sort of conglomerate, right, to assert a certain level of power to guide the development of culture, in this case, Christian culture. So St. Anselm, who lived 1033 to 1109, so we know exactly the time we're thinking of. So during the 11th century, he was a very important individual in terms of theological writings that were trying to reform the clergy, because at this point, we wish to, so say the medieval thinkers, wish to clearly separate the laity, right, or lay people, which are basically those who go to church, from those individuals who are in charge of running church affairs. So the clergy and the laity are two separate things. And what Anselm was particularly concerned with was asserting, this political power. What he wanted to do was to make sure that whatever force was going to be at work in guiding culture for the next X number of years, it was going to come from the church rather than from the pulpit, right? From the pulpit rather than the throne is what I'm trying to say. So the throne is there. The kings are not thrown out, but the church asserts its political power in this kind of vacuum that's been left now for hundreds of years. It moves in at the right time and asserts monotheistic thought, asserts the kinds of ideas that are being discussed in medieval philosophy. And St. Anselm is one of the first that looked at the notion of a theocratic government. This is what happens. It becomes a centralized form of political power, policy planning. It wields a tremendous amount of power, and depending on where you are, some of that power is held on to till almost the mid-1700s. But we see now a movement, a kind of power move by the Christian church to assert its identity and assert its power over the development of culture. Now, Anselm was politically active, absolutely, and to the point where he was often exiled. He was exiled twice out of England. So there was a recognition that what he was doing was politically dangerous. Now, what he was trying to do was to present to others, to both believers and unbelievers, or doubters will say, that Christianity was a rational system. It was a rational system that could be defended using the tools of philosophy, using reason and argument. And it was not just revealed doctrine. Now, ironically, Plato felt the same way about wisdom and knowledge, that it could only be revealed to certain people. Of course, the tools that you needed back then was a proper education, which only the aristocracy could afford. But here, Anselm is discussing the notion of Christianity as rational, not based simply on revealed doctrines or belief or leap of faith. And he did this, he presented Christianity as this rational system by, again, synthesizing Neoplatonism, some of the ideas associated with Plato, and then the at that time, very recently rediscovered text by Aristotle. And so was able to combine these two and was able to argue, right, that while faith may come before reason, you may believe something before you understand why, there was no fear of reason. Reason can expand faith. And this is something that becomes more difficult to prove as time goes on and the scientific revolution begins. It is there that we start having antagonistic relationships between reason and faith. But at this early time, or in the 11th century, reason expands faith. It allows us to understand what it is that we believe in. So here's Anselm in his own words. He writes, "I do not seek to understand that I may believe, but believe that I might understand. For this too I believe, since unless I first believe," remember, faith comes first, "unless I first believe, I shall not understand." And it goes on to say, "To me, it seems to be negligence if, after confirmation in the faith, we do not study to understand that which we believe." So this is how Anselm was able to use philosophical tools such as reason, argumentation, proof of evidence, logic. These are all tools that belong to philosophy, and apply them to theology in order to not destroy it, but to confirm its existence, confirm its inner workings. And so what happens in Anselm's work is that he's able to present this, this very singular argument about the existence of God, but he needed nothing but itself to prove. So he's able to start, in a sense, just with the idea of God and go on to prove it. Matter and first level logic and so on, it's as if you start with the notion of God already existing and then go out to prove that it does. Essentially, that's what Anselm is trying to do. So it's not the way that most arguments are structured, but this single argument, right, that needed nothing but itself alone for proof is the way in which Anselm was able to have the best of both worlds. A theological foundation, but one built on the scaffolding of philosophy. Now, what is this argument, right? What is kind of the bread and butter of this argument, which has been called an ontological argument? It's this self-contained idea that God exists. And he does it by simply positing this statement: a necessary being exists necessarily. And sounds simple, a little bit confusing, but that's essentially what he's saying. A necessary being. God has to exist, but he has to exist necessarily. And that's as far as, in terms of logic, that Anselm is able to take it, because he believes that this is all you need, right? It is, if it is possible that God exists, then it follows logically that God does exist. And so this is a very different way of performing philosophical argumentation, and he goes about it the following way. It still holds some kind of logical consistency, but he says, okay, here's what we're going to do. Imagine the greatest possible being. So you're imagining it, right? Imagine the greatest possible being. Now, does this being exist? Well, no, because you're only imagining it, and it does lack a very important property, which is existence. So if we did not imagine the greatest possible being, it's because it lacks this one attribute, right, of existence. But we could still imagine it. And that's what Anselm is able to do. He's able to say, if we can imagine it, it must exist. If we can think of it, it must exist. So now we can imagine a being with all of these attributes, right, plus existence, right? This is the greatest possible being. So we think, okay, this possible being, I'm just thinking of it. Now imagine this existence, or this being existing, that it truly is. And that is Anselm's argument. It's ontological because it has to do with being. That's what ontology is, the study of being. But the notion that the greatest possible being exists necessarily, right? For existence is a necessary property for the greatest possible being. And the way in which we're able to reconcile God is Anselm saying the greatest thing we can possibly think of would be a God. Therefore, it's possible. If we can imagine it, he must exist. So it looks logical, sounds consistent, right? The first cause argument relies on reasoning about causation, right? We're imagining something, observations about the universe, the beauty of nature, the beauty of the human form, the miracle of birth, all these things. These are the observations that we have that we now turn around and say, well, there must be something that informs it. There must be some higher power that makes this come into being. But what's happening here is we have this sort of kind of what philosophers call an aporia. An aporia is a kind of dead end. Because if you argue this, what it really asserts is that either God is necessary and is a necessary being, or is utterly impossible. It's not one or the other. You have to go for God is necessary. You must base your argument on that he is a necessary being. Why? Look around. If you're searching for reality, here it is. The beauty of nature, the miracle of birth, there it is, right? Somebody must be doing this. Somebody must be in charge. So therefore, the argument that it's utterly impossible essentially goes out the window. So God is necessary to explain the world around us. And that's essentially what Anselm's argument is all about. Now, the second individual we're going to look at is Aquinas. And Aquinas is much less of a Platonist as he is an Aristotelian, because St. Augustine, writing again around the 300s, was influenced by Plato. Not that these ideas were fresh, but Augustine, as an early theologian, saw in Plato's ideas about the beauty and perfection of eternal forms and ideas, was able to harness that onto the idea of God as itself eternal and perfect. Now, Aquinas, living in 1225 to 1274, right, during the 13th century, he was a later medieval theologian, and he was influenced by Aristotle. But he also said basically the same idea, because he was able to synthesize, right, bring together philosophy and theology in the notion that reason and scripture lead to the same thing. What he means by that is reason, which is these truths in one form, versus scripture, which is truth in a different form through parables and stories and metaphors. They lead to the same truths. Whether or not they contain the same truths is secondary, but both of those tools, reason or scripture, lead down to the same path, or lead down the same path to the same end. So the means may be different, reason, scripture. The ends are the same, truth. So natural theism, this idea that we have some kind of natural innate intelligence, that we can understand the world. It doesn't take much for us to look to understand, yes, not only is God a necessary being because it explains the beauty of the world around, but at the same time, reason is another way in which it's in fact the tool that I use to make that connection. That's really the way you should look at it. So this classic argument for natural theism, right? That's Aquinas, that we have in us this kind of natural and innate ability to understand. You'll see the same thing come up again with John Locke. He talks about our inner light, right? Our natural light. So when you think of enlightenment, that's where this is coming from. This notion that we have an inner light of reason and intellect to help us to understand and make those connections. So there's no conflict between philosophy and its tools and theology and its truths. Okay, Aquinas becomes, as you can imagine, a pretty popular and powerful and influential philosopher. And his work actually falls into the general category of Thomism, right? From his first name, Thomas. So Thomism is really kind of a new version of Aristotle and Aristotelian thinking. So we have Aristotle, we have Thomism, and we have scholasticism. And those three are essentially Aristotelian thought. So we're not deviating too far from original Greek thought. We're seeing it sort of clothed differently and termed or labeled differently. But essentially, it's the same kind of Aristotelian thinking. And for Aquinas, unlike Augustine, who was a Platonist, Aquinas was clearly an Aristotelian. And he wanted to use Aristotle's philosophy to make a stronger and better system of theology that he felt Plato's was lacking. And so we have to ask ourselves, why was Aristotle sort of somehow better at it? All right, why were his tools and his conclusions more beneficial, or marries up rather nicely with theological thought? So for Aquinas, Aristotle's view of the intellectual part of the soul, right? Because the soul has three parts, but the intellect, that was the part that lived on, right? That's the part that was compatible with this notion of personal immortality, which is, again, another key foundational idea in Christianity, that when we die, we go to heaven, hopefully, or hell, but we transmigrate, right? We move through different spheres of existence till we get to heaven. So transmigration is a really important idea that comes from Greek thought. It is now sort of clothed differently in theological thought, but essentially the same structure, the same movement, the same development. So Aristotle's idea about the intellectual part of the soul was very much compatible with personal immortality. And so not only that, but it doesn't disturb really in any important degree either field. Both work very well together. They work really hand in glove. And Christian doctrine can also be shown to be true through reason alone. So there's no attack by philosophy on religion, and certainly the other way around. So really they are very compatible, right? They move and they work together. And Summa Contra Gentiles is a book by Aquinas where he sits down and tries to work out these various arguments and use natural reason as well, right? Our intellect to show Catholic faith at work. Uses reason to explain the various sort of theological dogmas that are presented in his texts. But he says ultimately that nothing in reason contradicts faith. Reason expands faith, enhances faith, enhances a belief system. And so nothing revealed in faith will, by its very nature, also not contradict reason. So the two of them coexist very well. There isn't an issue using one or the other. They both lead to the same ideas. Now, of course, the most important issue with theology is proving the existence of God, because without that, the central core idea, the very foundation of theology, begins to crumble. So these philosophical tools are used to prove the existence of God. And Aquinas now throws out this ontological argument that Anselm had presented, saying, if we can imagine this being, then surely it must exist, right? And it must exist necessarily. And instead, Aquinas says, look, we need some other way of presenting the existence of God through causal relationships. And again, when you speak of logic, causal relationships are a very good way to go about trying to define why something is the way it is. So Aquinas borrows from Aristotle, and it is in Aristotle's work, this notion of an unmoved mover. And so the way that Aquinas is able to use Aristotle's idea with theology and enhance this proof of God's existence is in the following way. He says, look, he argues, first of all, whatever is moved by something, right? Moved to develop, moved to change, moved to perish and die away, whatever it may be. But whatever is moved has to be moved by something. It is the ultimate causal explanation. And so you have at one point a dilemma, because if that's the case, then everything moves everything else, right? You end up infinitely making this argument. So at some point, that chain must stop, right? There has to be, we don't want to call it a Big Bang, right? Because that's something else, but we want to call it that originary beginning. Because remember, the holy texts are saying, in the beginning there was nothing. Then God created something, created the world. So now on the one hand, you have to reconcile the notion that whatever moves is moved by something, which is a causal, logical argument, with a beginning, a specific beginning. So what happens is that chain, right, that infinite regress has to terminate at some point with this one thing or being or entity that is itself the mover of everything else. And itself does not move. Now, with Aristotle, he simply called it an unmoved mover. did not assign any kind of theological category, did not assign any kind of, Godhead or figurehead to it. He simply called it an unmoved mover. Now, this falls into Aquinas's organization of this relationship rather nicely. And Aquinas, as an Aristotelian, says, ultimately, the unmoved mover is God. He starts this whole ball rolling. That's essentially what he's saying. Now, it sounds elegant and simple, and it deals with both the notion that whatever moves is moved by something, or a causal relationship, and there has to be an originary unmoved mover. But when you look at it from a purely logical point of view, the conclusion actually contradicts the premise. Because on the one hand, you are positing that whatever moves is moved by something. Hence this infinite regress of things constantly being moved by other things. And yet the solution is to find something that does not itself move. So if that is the case, your premise is everything that moves is moved by something else, and your solution, right, your conclusion is, yes, but it's moved by something that does not itself move. That is where you have to make a leap of faith and say, okay, this is how Aquinas explains it. The unmoved mover begins everything. But it, that being, that entity, does not move. Now, what about the Big Bang Theory, right? That's a beginning. And don't think we are going to be dealing with cyclical time or historical time frames rather than a specific beginning and a specific end. Does it always have to be an unmoved mover as God? What about quantum theory, right? The Big Bang Theory. Those ideas don't contradict the notion of God, because they in fact at one point do support the idea of an unmoved mover. But that unmoved mover does not necessarily have to be God. It can also be a cataclysmic explosion that begins life. So I'm not saying one or the other is right or wrong, but there are other explanations. If you wish to go for the idea of an unmoved mover, you have to be willing to accommodate more than just simply a Godhead. So if the structure is sound, your solution to the premise that everything that moves is moved by something else, and you say that at one point something does not move, it begins. It could be a God, it could be a Big Bang Theory. So either way, it is still using the same structure, but arriving at different reasons why something begins at some point. So this is one serious but important issue pertaining to Aquinas' idea of the proof of God as the unmoved mover. Now, there's also the idea that Aquinas tells us that we can deduce some of these attributes of reason about God using reason alone. Again, if we're going to accept the idea that God is the original unmoved mover, we say, okay, if he does not move, that is because he's eternal. And this certainly fits with Greek thought. Remember, the pre-Socratics, every one of them said that the world has always already been there. So the notion that God is eternal and unmoving fits rather nicely. Now, God also has no body, right? He has no parts or no composition. In fact, he shouldn't even have a sex. We shouldn't even describe him as he. It should be it, right? A Godhead. But even that too is still nice, kind of a Platonic idea, that the fact that, you could have a pure idea that is simply embodied temporarily in the world. And when you think of the Son of God, Jesus Christ, that is a kind of a Platonic idea. The fact that Christ walked on the earth as the embodiment of God, right? God and Christ in one, walking this earth. And so these ideas are not far-fetched in terms of the philosophical background that Aquinas is using. He's using what's already there in ancient Greek philosophy. Because remember, those texts now reappear. Many theologians are reading them and finding many truths in this kind of thinking that allows them to continue to build a scaffolding around theological thought. So God does not move, ergo he is eternal. He has no body, therefore no attributes, but he exists and exists eternally. Essence and existence are essentially one of the same, right? His essence is his existence. What is his essence? Because remember, he does not have a sex or body, right? Existence, being. God is being. So not that God is like other things, utterly unique. other things are like God. So it's a one-way. So it's a one-way travel. God also is good. Just because the eternal beauty of forms and ideas from Plato, they are good. They are eternal. They are that which we aim towards. So the good of every goodness, omniscience, right? All powerful. These are all ideas that initially are read and heard from and discussed in ancient Greek thought. Now, another issue with Aquinas that he needed to reconcile was a perennial problem that we see discussed by Aristotle and Epicurus and many of the other thinkers, Augustine and Anselm as well, the notion of evil. And the response for Aquinas is a rather interesting one, because he says, look, to talk about evil as a separate thing is incorrect. Evil is just simply the subjective absence of good. It is the lack of something. So a lack being somehow that which becomes evil. And what is lacking, of course, is goodness. So it's not an objective thing. Evil is not an objective thing. If you believe Aquinas, it is the lack of good. That's what's missing. So evil only exists in relation to the existence of good. This is an idea that Hegel will pick up much later, that you need to see the totality of something. Something is hot because it is not cold. Something is cold because it is not hot. Something is sweet because it is not tart. So there has to be this totality. Both need to coexist for it to make sense. Now, finally, the argument I just spoke about just a moment ago with Aquinas about God as the unmoved mover. You can take a look at the 5 arguments that he presents, but ultimately, motion, causation, contingency, degree, and ends, they all essentially say the same thing. That movement, right, this unmoved mover, is both the beginning of this procedure of constant movement, but it's also this notion that the end result is perfection, is God. And so this is Aristotle's view of teleology, right? It's a teleological view of the development of the world. This unmoved mover begins something and lets it unfold. And once again, reason and faith coexist, right? Coincide in these two viewpoints. So finally, the teleological arguments that Aquinas has used are the way in which we understand beauty and perfection. We move towards that. So it's not pure reason, because we are looking at the world around us and seeing beauty, seeing the perfection that is possible in nature, the perfection through the miracle of birth, and all the issues that we see that make life what it is. And our natural inclination, right, our natural light, asking, how is this possible? Why is this possible? Who is making this happen? So it is based on observations in the material world, but we look at this world as being somehow well-designed and purposeful and having meaning. And the meaning is imparted not in the material world, in the metaphysical part, the metaphysical part, God. And so the natural world, right, its complexities and interdependencies and sophisticated creatures in nature still have this designer. And the designer for Aquinas is God. God is the unmoved mover and is the designer of all that is perfect in the world. And that's essentially it.